Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. Would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Absolutely. So I'm Sanjeevan Bala. I was the former Chief Data and AI Officer at ITV and currently have two non-exec director roles, one on Bakkavor and the other on SThree, both FTSE 250 companies.
Brilliant. Thank you. Would you mind explaining, I guess, your pathway from your executive career to what we would refer to as digital non-exec position, but you may see it slightly differently.
So my career, executive sort of pathway, as it were, was I started off very much in management consultancy. So that helped you sort of hone the skills around stakeholder management, traversing multiple sectors. Then moved into startups and scale-ups. So that was everything around sort of hyperscalers, certainly through the first digital .com bubble. And then moved into sort of client-side roles. And throughout my career, there's been certainly an innovation spike throughout that. International was a big dimension, so lived in lots of different sort of territories, countries, and therefore different international contexts, and lots of different sectors, so pharmaceutical, retail, financial services, media, entertainment, marketplaces. So I got to pattern match across a lot of those things.
Why did you choose to go down the route of the non-executive role?
Yeah, for me it was a very personal journey. So I looked at my career and I felt the early phases was what I was described as sort of the learning phase of your career. And you continue learning throughout. The second phase then is where you have an impact, because you're in leadership roles, you can have an impact on the strategy, how you're developing talent, what sort of shape of operating model you're designing, and that's great. But I sort of felt that I was creating an impact in one organisation. So the next phase for me was, how can I amplify my contribution by playing a more active role in more than one organisation? The non-exec roles were ideal for that because you can influence without control, but you can have a much greater impact across several organisations. So that for me was a very personal reason. And the second reason for me was the ability to kind of bring in different perspectives and learn and cross over that learning across different sectors and different contexts. That was a huge sort of personal learning sort of journey for myself.
In an era of ever increasing economic and geopolitical uncertainty, how do you see the importance of the digital non-exec role evolving?
So I think for me, if you think about the profile of what these leaders have experienced and the rate at which technology is rapidly changing, there's a couple of themes that cross over that make this particular profile of role absolutely ideal through this sort of period of sort of turbulence and uncertainty. So for me, the first is the rate of technology innovation, which means a lot of these leaders are used to horizon scanning, are used to sort of making risk-adjusted assessments around what's hype versus what's going to be real, and are able to sort of think about that capital allocation around what's going to get funded versus what's not. So that's a skill, because they're constantly horizon scanning. I think if we go back, there was blockchain, there was the metaverse, there was Y2K, all of these things are getting rapidly faster. So that skill set that these leaders have is baked into them. The second thing for me is a lot of these leaders have to influence without control, because in their executive lives, they don't control any of the value levers, right? Marketing, supply chain, commercial. So they've learnt the entire operations of the organisation through an indirect relationship. And that holistic view of the organisation is critical when you're horizon scanning and sensing what's happening, and how do you adapt and react to that. And that's the key skill through periods of uncertainty and disruption.
So I guess next question, most importantly, what advice would you give to that community of people, perhaps within the technology function right now, in leadership roles that are considering making their next move and pursuing a digital non-exec position?
So for me, what I think I experienced was a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, in that listed boards want you to have experience, but you don't have that experience, so how do you get that experience, right? So what I would suggest is get your first one, which would be a pro bono, or a multi-academy trust, a school trust, or a charitable trust, because what that does is it helps you understand the language of audit and risk, NOM, remuneration committee. So all the stuff, it gets you familiar with the language and how they operate. So that's the first piece. The second one for me is really hone your NED CV, which is radically different to your executive CV. Your executive CV is all about the impact, the what, if you will. Your NED CV needs to be one page, and it's all about the how. How did you influence the outcomes you've achieved as an executive? And that's you've got to really rethink how you write that single page document. Third one then is to secure sponsorship from your current executive team, because I think it does a few things really. It helps you pitch why this is a benefit to your existing executive role. but it also signposts very clearly that this is an avenue you're looking to pursue. And my last two would be, if you're in a listed organisation, connect with your current NEDs, because they've got incredible networks. Chances are they've seen you on the other side of the table, and they're going to be one of your best advocates. And my last one is think very deeply around the psychological shift you're going to have to make, because you're going to move from a model where you have full control of the levers and the way in which you create impact to having no control of the levers, and therefore you are influencing without control or authority. That requires a very different mental model around how you're going to learn and your learning model. So be really mindful and intentional about that transition.
In these uncertain times, if you had the opportunity to offer advice to a board, maybe to the chair, about what they should be looking for in a digital non-exec, what advice would you give?
So I think for me, what's really important is to really think through in a very thoughtful way, what divergent perspectives will this bring to the boardroom, and how additive would that be to the collective skill set across the boardroom? And what I mean by that is really look at, in this executive profile, for them to sort of outline what are some of the failures they've had, and how do they pattern match those failures to this particular board and this particular organisation. Because I think it's that skill set of pattern matching that's going to be really critical for how they abstract what they've learned in their executive lives and how they feel that might apply to the boardroom.
What would you see as the key benefits overall and some of the challenges from pursuing the digital non-exec career?
So I think if you're an exec and you then take on a non-exec, I think there's a really interesting sort of circular learning that starts to happen. So as an executive, you've typically had a lot of experience going into the boardroom and presenting your papers, right? But I know, and a lot of our audience will know, when they write those papers, they're already funneling towards a decision that you're trying them to get them to approve. So when you're on the other side, reading papers as a NED, you're very aware how those papers are written. So you scrutinise the gaps between the papers. You scrutinise where are things not joining up because you've been on the other side. Conversely, once you've done some NED work, the way you operate as an executive suddenly gets amplified because the way you think is very holistic, because you're very attuned to how audit and risk, the impact to NOM, the impact to capital allocation, and so you become much more rounded as an executive. So that's probably one of the biggest benefits. The other aspect is the network you then tap into is very different to the network that you might have established as an executive, because a lot of these other NEDs on the boards tend to be current or former CEOs, have extensive successful careers, and they operate in a slightly different cadence. And that's a completely different way of operating. Some of the challenges I think you can find coming out of executive life, where the way you learn perhaps is more of an experienced style learner, because you learn by doing and that sort of method. There aren't many forums you can go to as a non-exec to learn. I mean, there's obviously the formal code that's there and guidance, but it's more around some of the behaviours and the experience. What happens when an activist investor gets involved? There aren't playbooks for these things. So you have to be very active around how you think about filling those knowledge gaps. And that requires a different level of self-learning, but also how you tap into those networks to absorb that knowledge, because that isn't on the open forums. That can be quite challenging. Some of the other aspects that are less sort of pivotal to your executive spike in, let's say, digital data and technology, some of the things around sort of capital concerns, going concern, some of the fiduciary responsibility aspects are really important for you to figure out how do you fill those knowledge gaps if you don't come from those backgrounds. Because you as an individual have responsibility. You can't just simply deflect that to your audit and risk chair, who may be seasoned as a former audit partner, but you have an own responsibility on that as well, and that can be particularly challenging.
How do you think your career, your earlier career, ongoing career as a Chief Data and AI Officer has been of particular benefit to the boards that you sit on?
So I think in this era of sort of AI, both generative, agentic, I think increasingly organizations across every sector are facing this challenge around what does this mean for their industry and their business. I think in my executive life, having led a number of those transformations, you're able to sort of one pattern match, but then go beyond the hype and help the board and the executive team understand what's it actually take to be successful in some of these transformations. And you can then influence the direction of travel of things like the strategy day, the strategic context within which the organisation needs to operate within, the strategic context of the ecosystem within which it's operating in. And seeding some of those ideas and themes help flow through to how we think about principal risks, so if you audit and risk chair, but critically helps you be the counterbalance when boards can very quickly go down risk, assurances and controls when the topic of AI comes up, but you can be the counter voice around opportunity, growth and value creation. And having that balanced conversation in the boardroom is really important. Otherwise it can be over-governed, over-controlled, too much assurances, and it can stifle innovation.